Our Bible reading this morning is from Mark chapter 8, verses 27 to 38. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered him, "John the Baptist, and others, Elijah, and still others, one of the prophets." He asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He called the crowd together with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life?"
We all know that words have the power to name or shape us. Words have the power to name or shape us in ways that may lead to good or to ill, in ways that might lead to acceptance or rebuke. Who we say Jesus is shapes our journey as his followers. But how we see ourselves, the words we use to describe ourselves, will also shape how we follow this Jesus. Which makes me wonder, what do you think about when you hear the word Christian? There are lots of phrases that have come from the words of Jesus that have taken on a life of their own in our common speech. You can probably think of lots of them. Things like turn the other cheek, do unto others, don't cast your pearls before swine, don't hide your light under a bushel. What about, O ye of little faith, or salt of the earth? Don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing, or going the extra mile. Or what about the building on sand, or a wolf in sheep's clothing? Or then there are the words that seem to echo true again and again, those who live by the sword die by the sword. These are words that have slipped into our common everyday language. Even if you don't go to church regularly, even if you don't call yourself a Christian, you've probably heard quite a few of those terms. When Jesus spoke, he often used quite vivid images from life. And today, most people who use those same sorts of sayings would have no idea who first said them. And in some cases, those words have taken on a life of their own, so much so that they're now sometimes even used to mean something quite different from what they originally meant. That means we need to be particularly careful when we easily read our modern meanings back into the word of Jesus and miss the point of what he's trying to say. This Sunday's gospel is a classic case. How often do you hear people talking about the cross they have to bear? Oh, I've got this cross I need to bear. Jesus said, those who want to be my followers must deny themselves, take up their cross and follow me. But the idea of bearing your cross has taken on a life of its own. It can now mean everything from sinus trouble to rebellious kids to pimples, a harsh work environment, unemployment, maybe a broken leg, maybe a drunken husband, or maybe mortgage repayments. The list is endless of what we talk about when we say, oh, it's the cross I have to bear. It's come to mean those things that you have to learn to live with that life throws at you. To keep a stiff upper lip and get on with your life the best you can despite the undesirable or unavoidable trials. The old Greek idea or word of stoicism captures this. Don't let things get you down. Bear up under the load and make the best of things. But we need to be careful about this idea of bearing our cross. There's no question that good things happen and bad things particularly happen to good people. We all know that bad things do happen. And I'm not going to question the wisdom that says sometimes you just got to learn to live with those things that you can't change and make the best of life despite them. But if we read that idea into what Jesus is saying in this passage, we completely miss the point. In its original context, Jesus was talking about what it means to be someone who follows him. And so to take up your cross and follow was quite specifically about our willingness to cop the consequences of following Jesus, to understand that there is a risk to following in this way. Jesus had just explained to his disciples, and he'd argued with Peter, that taking up his cross literally meant being willing to be killed for what he was committed to. When he arrived in Jerusalem, the religious and national leaders gave him a simple choice. Back down, or we'll get rid of you. Words that still echo throughout our world today. He either had to walk away from the things he'd been saying and doing to stop rocking the boat, or he had to hold his ground and pay the ultimate price for it. Jesus has just explained to his disciples when he says, those who want to be my followers must deny themselves, take up their cross and follow me. He's saying if you choose to take your stand with him, you have to be willing to cop the consequences. You can't choose to follow Jesus and keep your head down. It's about being out there on the road with him. When Jesus walks out into the open to protest about the way things are, you can either look on from a distance or you can follow him. And when he says you need to deny yourself in order to follow him, he is saying you have to hand over the keys. You don't tag along at a distance. You get in there right behind and you walk with him. Denying ourselves actually means giving up the right to determine which issues we're going to stand with Jesus on and which issues we're going to keep quiet on. Denying yourself means that every time the way of Jesus comes into conflict with the ways of the world around us, you don't make the decision on what's best for you. You make the decision on following Jesus and what it will mean. In our world today, we are constantly surrounded by situations that call us to follow the way of Jesus. And there are others who would call us to just look after yourself. Just look after number one. Charity begins at home. All those sorts of things. And the way of Jesus calls us to something different. Someone once quoted that when you have plenty and more than you need, you don't build walls. You just extend the table. When you have more than you could possibly ever need or use, you don't build fences, but you open doorways and share. The whole point around communion every week is that simple act of reminding us to share. Throughout the world, in every church, as they gather together on Sunday, there is a breaking of bread and sharing of a cup. A simple, constant reminder of what it means to follow Jesus. This is not for us. This is not for us to make us feel better or particularly blessed. This is to remind us of our journey. Our journey is to continue to take what we have, to break it and to share it. It's something that a little 2-year-old can understand. And yet so often as adults in our world, we get caught up with different ideas and think that it's just for us. You can't have the benefits of following Jesus without also sharing the costs. Sometimes following Jesus, sharing his love and compassion, means standing over and against what the world around us might say. One of the options we have as Christians is to simply play at being Christian, of putting on the front, of looking like we've got it all together, of denying that there's any problems, of being super nice, of being, upright, good citizens of our world. And, there is nothing wrong in principle with that, except sometimes we need to be the voice of those who are voiceless. Sometimes we need to use the words that others don't have the chance to say. Sometimes we need to call for a different way of being, to be a person who walks alongside those. That's what it means to bear our cross. To not only just do it as a self-denial thing, but as a way of living, a way of being that says, no, we're together. And it doesn't matter what your faith or your colour or your creed is. Together we are called to follow this way of Jesus. It's not about just accepting the suffering that happens in life. It's actually about standing up against that suffering and being that voice that needs to be heard. One of the hardest things to do, one of the most difficult things to do, is to be the person you are called to be. The greatest fear we need to overcome, the greatest cross we need to bear in many ways, is to take up our cross, to take up our name, and to bear it willingly and openly and say, this is who I am, and I stand for this. I might struggle with what that means. I might have questions and doubts, but this is who I am. I can be no other than this person God has made me to be. Too many suffering people in our world have heard this terrible distortion of what Jesus said. People living in poverty, people living in violent relationships, people with chronic illness or grief that they cannot get rid of. And people tell them, well, it's the cross you have to bear. But that's not what Jesus is saying here. That's not what this is about. This is about a radical choosing of God's way of life over a more conventional and safe way. Another way of putting it might be, come on people, let go of your fear. Take a risk on God. Put your lives on the line. What good will it be for any of us to preserve our lives but lose our very reason for living? Safety won't do us much good. So come on, take a risk. Follow me as I walk in God's ways of wisdom and love, ways that lead to abundant life for everyone. For me, that's what being a Christian is about. Will you join me and follow in this way? Amen.